The original State of Decay was a very flawed game. It had a painfully generic story, bland repetitive missions, ran horribly despite being very ugly, had some really scummy business practices, and is easily one of the buggiest games I've ever played. And yet, I've put in more than 100 hours into it, and I'd even go as far as calling it one of my favorite games of all time. State of Decay was an incredibly ambitious, open-world base-building zombie survival game that had a myriad of unique and interesting ideas that it couldn't quite pull off as elegantly as most people would have liked due to its relatively low budget and Microsoft's annoying 2GB size limit for all XBLA games at the time. So when a sequel was announced that promised to be bigger and better, I was very much looking forward to it. And when it finally released on May of last year, I kind of forgot about it and waited a year for a price drop. Not gonna lie, I'm kind of a cheapskate when it comes to stuff like this. But anyways, now that I've put my fair share of time into the game, is State of Decay 2 worth playing, or are you better off just sticking with the original? Let's find out.
Get up, 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 run, 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 run. Oh shit! No! Come on, break free, break free. No, 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 we're not dying, we're not dying, we're not dying, we are not dying. What? I'm tapping B! I'm tapping B!
Oh, you gotta be fight him! No! No! No!
Whenever there's an article, video, or thread about the first State of Decay, you will always, without fail, find people talking about the death of their favorite character in the comments. Every single person who played that game has their own war stories about how greed, arrogance, bad luck, or just plain old foolishness led to the tragic death of one of their survivors. In my case, the first character I ever lost was Maya Torres, an ex-soldier that joins your group early into the game after you save her from some zombies. I was driving back from a run with very little health and a pretty messed up truck. I knew the risks driving in it would entail, but I refused to change cars because I didn't want to leave any of the loot I had gathered. I was greedy, and that got Maya killed. A zombie pulled her out of the truck, and I watched helplessly as the horde brutally teared her apart. It was horrible. It left an empty feeling in my stomach, and I felt genuinely terrible and guilty. And unfortunately, this is an experience and feeling that is completely absent in State of Decay 2. The game does have permadeath just like the original, but it's missing one key ingredient: humanity. The survivors in the first State of Decay weren't exactly the most complex or fleshed out people in the world, but they at least had character, and I actually grew very attached to them. When one of them died, it was an event. It was a tragedy.
Maya didn't join us until pretty late in this whole thing, but right from the beginning she was one of us. She really cared. Not just about surviving, but about doing the right thing. I wish I'd gotten to know her better.
Even if other survivors in the game shared the same voice actor, visually speaking, you would never find any other characters that looked like Ed, Maya, Jacob, Sam, or Marcus. You couldn't just replace them with someone else like you would a broken action figure. Well, in State of Decay 2, aside from the two starters you pick in the beginning, every single person you encounter is randomly generated.
Randomly generated?
Randomly generated.
Their looks, voices, attitudes, and even their names are all randomized, and man, I get why they did this, but I found it really hard to grow attached to the people in my community when I could find 100 others who share a lot of the same features, and considering that they all act like robots half the time. This might sound a bit cold, but when I lost a character, I wasn't sad because I particularly liked that person, but instead because of what that person offered to my community.
He was the fucking doctor too!
To put it bluntly, the survivors in State of Decay 2 aren't characters, they're resources. You never really form an emotional attachment to them. their only value is purely from a visual and or mechanical perspective, which I found to be very disappointing.
Ah, no, he's not the medic. Es el chavo con la voz chida. Never mind then.
To make matters worse, State of Decay 2 is also one of those games that lets the player make their own stories, which is a fancy way of saying that there is no story. In place of a campaign, there's just a bunch of randomly generated side missions that, while fun at first, quickly start feeling like chores. Plus, they also have a tendency to break half the time, but we'll cover that later.
Why won't you die?
The closest thing to a story here are some brief radio transmissions from a paramilitary group called Red Talon and another one called The Network, which is implied to be founded by the survivors from the first State of Decay. And real talk, hearing Lily on the radio again made me so happy. Lily! It's a real shame that these transmissions never amount to anything though. I thought you were gonna be given a choice to join one of them at some point, or they'd play a bigger role in the game later on, but unfortunately they strictly stay in the background, which was very disappointing. I mean, the campaign in the first State of Decay wasn't exactly anything to write home about, but it still served a very important function. It gave something for the player to strive towards outside of the scavenging and base building gameplay loop. Without a narrative to push the game along, State of Decay 2 feels empty and purposeless. Combine that with the practically non-existent characters and you got a pretty big problem at hand. But again, I understand why they went in this direction. It's very hard to have a cohesive story when potentially every character in said story is expendable. A lot of accommodations need to be made to make that work. Combine that with the addition of co-op, a feature that doesn't lend itself to serious storytelling all that well. The lukewarm critical reception of the original campaign, the massive popularity of its story-free expansion, and the decision to ditch story and characters in favor of a more gameplay-focused experience starts to make more sense. So the question then becomes, is the gameplay in State of Decay 2 strong enough to carry the entire game on its own? Okay, so if you asked me this question at any point between May 22nd of last year and March 26th of this year, I'd probably tell you no. While State of Decay 2 was a huge improvement in terms of graphics, performance, animations, mission variety, and mechanical complexity, I'd still rather play the original for one simple reason: the difficulty. I always saw State of Decay as a game about hope, about moving forward in spite of the endless tragedies and difficulties that befall your community, and the difficulty was a huge factor in that, so the fact that I never experienced any death or tragedy in my first 16-hour playthrough was very underwhelming, to say the least. I always felt in control of every situation I was in, and never went through any serious resource or morale problems. Frankly, it was boring. Like, as an example, one of the big new features in State of Decay 2 was the addition of the Blood Plague. All the marketing painted this thing as a terrifying, unforgiving, and brutal mechanic that would force you to choose between the individual lives of your survivors and the well-being of the entire group.
This is our only one, but we need everybody we've got.
However, in reality, the Blood Plague is all bark and no bite. For starters, actually getting infected takes a lot of abuse, and whenever one of your guys actually manages to contract it, you're given a whopping 2 to 3 hours to cure him before he turns. So, considering how much time you're given, you'd think that obtaining a cure would be a lot of work or cost a lot of resources, but that's not the case at all. Producing a cure only takes 2 medicine points, and you don't even need a high-level infirmary or even a doctor. Call me crazy, but I think that making a cure to a disease that literally turns your skin inside out should be a lot harder to make than crafting a bloody toolbox. That being said, everything I've detailed thus far only applies to my first playthrough on the standard difficulty mode. In March 27th, Undead Labs released the Choose Your Own Apocalypse update, which added 2 new difficulties, Dread Zone and Nightmare. And here's the interesting thing. State of Decay 2 is one of the only games I can think of where playing it on a higher difficulty made me completely change my mind on its quality. It's kind of amazing, really. Now, even if you haven't played neither State of Decay before, Dread Zone is still the difficulty I'd recommend you start with. It punishes you for your mistakes and offers a legitimate challenge while generally remaining fair.
Oh, feo! Ese entró. Héctor.
Ya voy.
Héctor,
I'm grabbing bullets. Oh my god! I'm fucking reloading!
Shit! Get fucked up! I'm out of here. Oh shit!
Every single seemingly trivial change that Dread Zone brings to the table makes the experience 100 times better than what we got at launch. For instance, because resources and items are scarcer, you can't solely rely on looting to meet the needs of your community. Building facilities and establishing outposts to generate resources becomes a must. Consequently, enlisting characters with useful skills like hydroponics, for example, which allows you to upgrade your farms, turns into a continuous goal. On top of that, cars are rarer and break down more easily. You can't use them as a crutch to take out entire hordes like in the first game. At least, not without ending up stranded on the streets. Hordes are also bigger and spawn more frequently. Zombies hit a hell of a lot harder, and probably one of my favorite changes, your minimap no longer shows every Z in your immediate vicinity, which encourages you to rely on stealth and forces you to be more aware of your surroundings.
Oh, fuck.
The Blood Plague also becomes a real threat in Dread Zone. While the required resources for the cure remain the same, the time it takes for your character to turn is lowered dramatically down to 20 to 30 minutes. Plus, you can get infected a lot faster and easier, especially thanks to the addition of the Blood Plague Juggernauts, who not only do and take a ton more damage than the regular Juggernauts, but can also raise your infection meter in a matter of a few hits. Finally, there's the Plague Hearts. Despite them technically being the end goal of the game and the characters constantly reminding you how dangerous they are, they weren't really that big of a challenge in the original difficulty. Taking out these things just boiled down to hitting it till it releases this red mist stuff and killing the zombies that spawn nearby. Rinse and repeat until it blows up. In Dread Zone, however, while you can still cheese the hell out of them, they can turn into death traps if you tackle them unprepared. We learned that the hard way.
Run out, just run.
Casi me muero.
Go to the car, go to the car.
Esa mierda.
Oh, fuck! No! Oh no, visual. No tengo vida. No. Puta, me morí. No. Get up, get up. Okay, pick me up. Puta, se me murió. Oh my god. No, todavía está vivo, todavía está vivo. Espérate, wait for me. Pick me up. Corre. Oh fuck. Para de mover la pierna, dale, dale, corre. Vale, verga. Fuck, that's so much.
To me, Nightmare is the quintessential State of Decay experience, my go-to difficulty mode. However, I must warn you that it really lives up to its name. Like, for the sake of comparison, I went from losing 0 survivors in the standard difficulty, to losing 2 in Dread Zone, to losing an outstanding 11 in Nightmare. Everything that made Dread Zone challenging is back in full force and then some. Right out of the gate, not only are rucksacks rarer than ever, but a solid chunk of the map is already looted, so you need to fight tooth and nail for every single resource you find. The Blood Plague also goes from being a joke, to being a threat, to being legitimately horrifying. A single bite can fill up half of your infection bar, and it only takes 10 minutes for the blood plague to kill your character. On top of that, there's also plague hearts littered all throughout the map, and special zombies like juggernauts, bloaters, and ferals can now spawn in packs. It's as terrifying as you might imagine. Now, that being said, if I had to describe Nightmare in a single phrase, it'd be a double-edged sword. On one hand, Nightmare minimizes a lot of the issues I had with the game. Like, for example, in most survival titles, you go from attacking things with a stick and sleeping in a dirt hut to building monuments and conquering your surroundings. Well, in State of Decay, even if you're swimming in resources, you'll always have this brick wall artificially preventing you from achieving these things. You can only ever have a set number of survivors. You'll always have a limit on how many things you can build and where you can build them, etc. Ultimately, there's only so much you can do. You can never take back the world from the zombies or rebuild society, even if you think you could. The way Nightmare goes about hiding this is by offering an experience where the player will most likely never reach this point. Due to its frankly absurd difficulty, you never really get the chance to develop long-term ambitions or to think about bigger picture stuff like story or characters. You're basically living rucksack to rucksack here, and while this might not be the most elegant solution, it still works. It worked on me at least. However, on the other hand, I have to admit that Nightmare also brings out and accentuates a ton of the worst aspects of the game, mainly the AI and the bugs. It's no secret that State of Decay 2 has a ton of technical issues. It's nowhere near as bad as the first game, but it's up there.
Let's try and be sneaky. The fuck? What the fuck? Oh my god, ¿qué puta pasó?
You can't go a single session without encountering at least a handful of things not working as intended. I'm talking stuff like falling through the map, weird visual bugs, mission markers that lead nowhere, mission companions dying for no reason, enemies freezing in place, texture errors that make the game look like Sin City, characters getting stuck in geometry, characters spawning in geometry. You get the picture. And here's the thing, in the lower difficulties, these are just mildly annoying or amusing, but when they happen in Nightmare, they become glaring flaws. For instance, if the immortal enemy bug happened to me in Nightmare instead of in Standard, there's no doubt in my mind that my character would have died. No doubt about it.
What the fuck? He shot me through the door!
Frankly, it's really hard to forgive stuff like this when even the smallest mistake could lead to the permanent death of your characters and when resources are as scarce as they are. Now, all that being said, to give credit where credit is due, Undead Labs has actually done a wonderful job supporting the game with frequent patches to fix bugs and constant updates that add neat things like crossbows, new missions, and much needed quality of life features. They also do these really comfy and surprisingly transparent weekly streams where they share plans for future content updates and directly engage with the community.
Nerd McGee is like, hey! I still haven't heard back about if y'all are adding juggernauts that spawn baby ferals when they die out of their tummies. And no, that is not in the game.
No, and seriously, seek help.
In many ways, State of Decay 2 feels like a sequel that doesn't add enough to what came before it, while at the same time removing a lot of the things that made people fall in love with the original. However, I truly believe that Undead Labs are doing their best at taking feedback from the community and slowly transforming State of Decay 2 into the quality title we all want it to be. As I said before, the difficulty update practically saved the game for me, and the recently released Heartland DLC looks to be everything I wanted, so seriously, props to the devs for continuing to support the game like this. Ultimately, State of Decay 2 is a very flawed game, and it's obvious that I have some really mixed feelings on it, but I still had a blast with it, and I thoroughly recommend it.
Oh, Pate, también sabes que puedo hacer. Puedo pedir ayuda. Some other guy might come help us.